Everyone has anxiety about systemic failures. Sociologists are the people who channel that anxiety into analysis. Exploring media coverage of COVID-19 actually provides a wonderful opportunity to take a look at the culture wars and the work of many of the theorists that we're discussing in this class. The concept of a moral panic is critical here. The term was first used by Marshall McLuhan in 1964 and developed by Stanley Cohen in the 70s. As Cohen himself notes, calling something a moral panic does not imply that this something does not exist or happened at all, and that the reaction is based on fantasy, hysteria, delusion, and illusion, or being duped by the powerful. Common moral panic issues among the culture wars include disease, immigration, xenophobia, crime, young people today, and what's going on in the mass media or some combination thereof. Let's take a look at the stages of a moral panic. In the first case, someone or something or a group is defined as a threat to the community. That threat is depicted and turned into something recognizable by the media. This arouses public concern. Policymakers and authorities respond, and the issue results in some sort of social change in the community. This isn't to say that a community might not be facing a challenge or a problem, but rather this focuses on the way groups respond and how they codify or understand the problem. The media plays a key role in setting the agenda and framing the event. It goes on to transmit images and stories that back up those positions, and it really was the one that broke the silence or made the claim about the nature of the problem in the first place. Cohen highlights the characteristics of a moral panic: concern that, or a belief that a group or behavior is deviant and a threat to the larger society, hostility toward that group, with them becoming folk devils, initiating an us versus them mentality, widespread acceptance or consensus that that behavior is a real threat, with moral entrepreneurs stepping in as the leaders of the community, disproportionate action taken against that group. Overall, moral panics tend to be highly volatile, and they wane as news stories hit the news. Let's return to this idea of folk devils for a moment. Folk devils are the people or practices labeled as a threat to the larger social order. Stanley Cohen originally discussed the mods and rockers in the seaside vacation towns. The battles between them were sensationalized by the media, highlighting youth as the problem rather than the problematic economic situation in which youth found themselves. In addition to folk devils, we also have our moral entrepreneurs. Moral entrepreneurs are those who wish to persuade others to adopt or maintain a norm. The rule creators are the moral crusaders who are focused on convincing regardless of the means that they're using. They tend to be our more professional or elite members of our society. Rule creators are reliant on professional classes that produce data, and also on rule enforcers. Rule enforcers are the working class compelled to justify their role and demonstrate effectiveness. If they're too effective, their role is unnecessary. If they're not effective enough, then clearly they aren't able to do their jobs. In 1978, Stuart Hall and Co.'s classic work, Policing the Crisis, took a close look at moral panics in mainstream media. Hall points out that it's not just content and language that impacts thought, but also how news media is structured, packaged, and distributed. How are the assumptions embedded in text and data actually part of a process of signification and belief about people? Hall sees moments like these, conjunctural moments, moments when there's tension between the balances of powers within the states and contradictions, as moments of both opportunity and great danger. At moments when the state is most vulnerable to challenge, it's also most likely to defend itself. Hall's 1978 Policing the Crisis looked at coverage of muggings. While it seemed as if this was a new problem, Hall and Co. showed the way this moral panic was actually really emblematic of the disintegration of the welfare state under Margaret Thatcher. With Policing the Crisis, Hall and Company challenge us to take a deeper look at media coverage and how that coverage interacts with policy and the collection and production of data to present a crisis in a particular way. How does framing the crisis in that particular way shape policy at a critical juncture in history? Hall argued that a crisis in state legitimacy or a crisis in hegemony was being masked by a focus or a moral panic on a brand new urban problem, muggings. A moral panic that invoked fears of race and class provided a way for the state to reestablish its legitimacy. And while street crime is certainly a real social problem, during the time period that this push was ongoing, it was actually rising much more slowly than it had in previous periods. Mugging did show a significant increase as a crime, but primarily because it wasn't classified as a separate crime before. In this way, statistics were manipulated by the state to paint a picture that was largely inaccurate. I think it's safe to say that we are once more at a moment where there is a real threat to hegemony and the legitimacy of the state. But being good critical theorists, we also have to look at this moment in its own specificity and not try to analyze it simply as moments in the past have been analyzed. Undermining the legitimacy of science, corporate control of media, distrust in governmental leaders, environmental crisis, political polarization, and increasing wealth gaps have all combined to threaten the hegemony and legitimacy of the state. But I think we should consider how this moment is different or unique, just as Gramsci and Stuart Hall would encourage us to do so. In this case, what I see evolving is moral panics targeted to specific audiences rather than an overall moral panic. We've already discussed the way social media can really enhance confirmation bias and lead us to our own echo chambers. This is really showing up in the variety of moral panics we have to choose with from the COVID-19 crisis. There is a real crisis here, but whether you see it as one of foreign influence, predatory economics, predatory leadership, irresponsible individual behavior, impending economic collapse, or incompetent leadership really has a lot to do with who you were to start off with. So let's just take two to simplify. We have the threat, either the failure of leadership or irresponsible individual behavior. This has been simplified by the media into incompetent leadership or individuals acting in irresponsible ways regardless of the other pressures within their lives. In other words, it's reduced to partiers rather than those going to work. Concern emerges at that symbol, or the simple invocation of that narrative creates an immediate larger social concern or issue. We all understand about staying home, or we all share frustration with leadership. A larger response comes into play, whether it's state leadership's response or people's response to those individuals, pressure from peers, and eventually a social change is required in our behavior, whether it's all of us staying home or turning to state leadership rather than federal leadership. As in all moral panics, our moral entrepreneurs arrive to make the rules and enforce them, and our folk devils exist to highlight the problems. In the incompetent leadership model, we see all sorts of things pointed out to us, leaders either acting incompetently or profiting off of the problem. From the inappropriate behavior by individuals, we're told about individuals who simply went out when they should have stayed in. People partying or having a good time are central in this, even though the majority of people going out are doing it primarily for essential services. So my challenge to all of you is to take a look at this conjuncture moment and ask yourself, where are the larger systemic failures? In what ways are larger systemic failures masked by the moral panic going on over the COVID-19 epidemic? In what ways is systemic failure masked or hidden by the existing and competing narratives? So what happens post-vaccine? We're still going to have wealth inequality, a financial crisis, probably a worsening housing crisis. We're still going to have a healthcare crisis. What happens next? In what ways has the current framing of the crisis protected the system and protected many of the inequalities that we're currently experiencing? Cultural studies is not just a critique. Despite our nihilism, we still want people to act. You are an important part of knowledge creation, the providing of services, politics and legislation, cultural production, and a host of other aspects that can change our world. While we may have pessimism of the spirit, we have optimism of the will.